A faint light flickered in a quiet hospital room in Santa Barbara, November of 1971. Outside, the ocean winds moved gently against the windows, as if carrying whispers of the California coast into the stillness. Within, a young woman lay upon a narrow bed, her breath uneven, her body small and fragile beneath the white sheets. She had once walked through the grandest rooms of Manhattan, bathed in the flash of endless cameras, her laughter echoing against the silver walls of Andy Warhol's factory. Yet now, at the age of only 28, she drifted into silence. Edie Sedgwick, the bright star who had burned with rare brilliance and destructive intensity, was no more. Her story remains one of beauty and despair, of art and ruin, of a generation caught in its own illusions. Welcome, gentle listener. I invite you to leave a note in the comments telling us when and where you are listening tonight. In this way, our memories may weave together across the world. And if you wish to support this circle of remembrance, please press subscribe before we begin. The beginning of Edie Sedgwick's story does not lie in New York, nor in the glitter of fashion magazines, but in the wide and shadowed landscapes of California. To understand the woman who captivated Warhol's camera, we must first step back into the world that shaped her earliest years. For her childhood carried both the wealth of a storied name and the unspoken sorrows that would never release their hold upon her. The Sedgwicks were a family of deep roots in American history, a name carried with pride among the halls of New England and later transplanted into the West. Wealth, horses, and vast ranch lands framed the life of Edie's father, Francis Minturn Sedgwick, known as Fuzzy. He was a man who sought order and authority, a figure who controlled his family with rigid expectation and demanded strength even in moments where gentleness might have been called for. Edie's mother, Alice, was quieter, a presence often described as graceful yet subdued, struggling herself under the weight of the household. Edie was born in 1943, the seventh of 8 children, into a house filled with both brilliance and darkness. The Sedgwicks were not an ordinary family. Their wealth shielded them from certain hardships, yet it also created an isolated world where appearances mattered and silence covered many wounds. Several of Edie's siblings suffered from severe mental illness, a reality that was whispered about but rarely confronted openly. Depression, breakdowns, and eventual tragedies unfolded around her in those early years, leaving marks upon her heart even before she could name them. One can imagine the young Edie walking through the corridors of the family ranch in Santa Barbara, her small feet echoing on polished floors, her eyes catching the light that filtered through high windows. Horses grazed in the distance, and the hills stretched wide beneath the Californian sky. Yet inside, the atmosphere was different, heavy with discipline, expectations, and the hidden struggles of her brothers and sisters. It is said that her father could be cruel, demanding obedience with little tolerance for vulnerability. In such a house, a child learns to wear masks, bright smiles for the outside world, carefully guarded silences within. Was it here that Edie learned to embody a role so perfectly, to dazzle others while hiding her deepest fears? Her earliest schooling took place in elite institutions, where she was surrounded by children of privilege. Yet even among them, she was marked by fragility. She was slender, sensitive, with a quality of brightness that drew others near, and yet made her vulnerable. Teachers recalled her as a girl both lively and delicate, prone to sudden shifts of mood, as if the storms of her family's world were already stirring within her. She developed an interest in art from an early age, sketching, drawing, and dreaming of forms and colors beyond the strict boundaries of her upbringing. This creative spark, however, was always interlaced with an undertone of sadness. The Sedgwick family's struggles were not spoken of in public. Appearances were carefully maintained, as though the wealth of the ranch could serve as a wall against the truth. But tragedies accumulated. Several of Edie's brothers would later succumb to mental breakdowns, hospitalizations, or early deaths. In these stories, we glimpse the fragility of a family that, for all its wealth and prestige, carried deep and unresolved sorrows. Edie absorbed these currents as a child, even if she could not fully understand them. Her world was both golden and fractured, a duality that would follow her throughout her life. One must wonder what it felt like for her in those years, walking out beneath the vast skies of California, the smell of dry earth and horses rising in the air, while knowing that inside her home there were shadows she could not escape. Did the open land give her a sense of freedom, or did it only magnify the loneliness of her family's silence? As she grew, Edie became increasingly aware of her difference, of her need to shine and yet her struggle to remain grounded. The discipline of her father clashed with her natural desire for self-expression. Friends from her youth later remembered her as someone who carried both light and melancholy, who could be radiant in one moment and withdrawn in the next. This quality of shifting presence would later make her magnetic before Warhol's camera, but in childhood it revealed itself as vulnerability. By her teenage years, cracks in her world became more pronounced. She suffered from eating disorders, a reflection of the tension between control and chaos that marked her family. Food, body, and image became battlegrounds upon which deeper sorrows played out. Hospital stays began to punctuate her young life, attempts to stabilize what was already unraveling beneath the surface. For a girl of such promise, such beauty, the burden of her family's legacy and her own struggles proved heavy. Yet even within these trials there remained that strange luminosity, a spirit that sought to rise beyond circumstance. It is here, in the contrast between the Californian sun and the shadows of her household, that Edie's story begins to take shape. Her later allure in New York, her ability to captivate rooms and cameras, was not born of glamour alone. It was born of this early tension, the desire to be seen and loved, to be free, even as darkness pulled her inward. Imagine her in those years, standing at the window of the family house, the hills rolling endlessly into the horizon. The scent of eucalyptus drifts through the evening air. Somewhere a horse whinnies in the distance. And yet inside, silence holds the family captive, each member alone in their private sorrow. A child in such a place learns to seek escape, to dream of other worlds where beauty might erase pain. For Edie, this dream would one day lead to New York, to Warhol, to fame, and to ruin. But that is still far ahead. For now, we leave her as a child of California, caught between sunlight and shadow, her footsteps echoing down the long corridors of her family's house. They fade slowly, as though she is walking into another room, one whose door is waiting to be opened. The sound of her small footsteps fades into the distance, down a corridor lined with heavy doors that seldom opened. Behind each one lay fragments of the Sedgwick family's inner world, stories that remained hidden from neighbors and acquaintances, yet left scars upon every child. To speak of Edie is to speak also of her lineage, for she was not born into an ordinary household. The Sedgwicks were a family woven from brilliance and fragility, where wealth covered the silence of illness, and appearances were guarded as though they could protect against despair. Her father, Francis Minturn Sedgwick, stood at the center of this household. Tall, commanding, and insistent on discipline, he held himself as a man of authority. Known to his children as Fuzzy, his presence was both magnetic and forbidding. He valued control, the order of his ranch, the strength of will. Yet behind this image lay turbulence. Accounts from those who knew the family suggest that Fuzzy himself battled inner storms, sometimes cruel, sometimes unpredictable, a man who demanded obedience without allowing vulnerability. For a daughter like Edie, sensitive and searching, this figure cast a long and difficult shadow. Her mother, Alice, was gentler, described as refined and graceful, yet she too carried the weight of her family's troubles. Some say she sought to preserve harmony by avoiding confrontation, by smoothing over the ruptures with silence. But silence, however well intended, can deepen wounds. The Sedgwick children lived under this roof where order was demanded, but compassion was not always given. Several of Edie's siblings suffered from severe mental illnesses, conditions poorly understood at the time and often treated with shame rather than openness. Hospitalizations were common, whispers spread within the family, but little was spoken aloud. The walls of their home bore witness to breakdowns, depressions, and unspoken grief. For a child, such an environment is both bewildering and formative. Edie grew up not only with horses grazing under the Californian sun, but also with the quiet knowledge that her family carried fractures too deep to ignore. Her brother Bobby, brilliant in his own right, was one of those most visibly afflicted. Later, he would endure repeated hospital stays, his mind tormented in ways the family could scarcely name. Another brother, Minty, also suffered, his spirit troubled, his life cut short in ways that left a mark on all who loved him. The Sedgwicks, for all their grandeur, were bound by these tragedies, and Edie, the seventh child, observed, absorbed, and carried them in silence. How does a child reconcile such contradictions? To walk through halls of privilege, to ride horses across vast lands, and yet to return home to whispers of illness and shadows of fear. Perhaps this is why Edie's later presence seemed so radiant and tragic all at once. She had learned early to mask pain with beauty, to cover fractures with a dazzling performance. When the world looked upon her, they saw only the brightness she allowed them to see. Few recognized the sorrow hidden behind her eyes. The Sedgwick household was also marked by rigid control over the children's lives. Fuzzy demanded perfection and often shamed weakness. Edie's early struggles with eating and health were seen not as cries for help, but as flaws to be corrected. Discipline was sharp, words could cut, and tenderness was rare. Such an upbringing instills both resilience and fragility. It teaches one to endure, yet it leaves wounds unhealed. In later years, Edie would speak rarely of her childhood, and when she did, it was often with ambivalence. She recalled the beauty of the ranch, the wide skies, the horses that became her companions. But beneath these memories lay another truth, a family suffocated by its own silence. Her mother, unable to break free of her husband's authority, could not provide the comfort her children needed. Her father, locked in his own struggles, could not soften his control. The result was a house where appearances were immaculate, but the inner lives of the children remained isolated. It is tempting to imagine the young Edie standing by a bedroom door, hearing her father's voice rise in anger, or her siblings cry in despair, while she stood still, afraid to move. In such moments, a child learns to retreat into herself, to dream of other worlds where kindness might exist. Perhaps this is why she clung so strongly to art, to drawing, to beauty. For in those fragile lines and images, she could create a realm beyond her father's command, beyond the sorrow of her brothers. The Sedgwicks were a family that embodied the contradictions of their era: prestige and fragility, brilliance and breakdown. They were known among their circles as accomplished, refined, connected to old American history. Yet within their own walls, they lived with grief that was never spoken. Mental illness, now understood with greater compassion, was then a source of shame. Institutions were cold, treatments harsh, and stigma deepened the isolation. The children bore this silence, each in their own way. Some collapsed under it, others rebelled, and Edie carried it within, letting it shape the luminous mask she would later present to the world. In these early years, the seeds of her tragedy were already planted. The longing to escape, the desire to be adored, the need to shine brightly enough to outpace the darkness, all of these were born here, in the shadowed halls of her family's home. She was not simply a girl destined for fame. She was a daughter of a house where sorrow whispered constantly, where silence weighed heavily, and where beauty became both refuge and disguise. When we think of Edie in later years, photographed in her short dresses and tights, eyes lined in black, hair cropped into a pixie crown, it is easy to forget the child who once walked through California ranch land, holding secrets too heavy for her small shoulders. Yet that child never left her. She carried the corridors of her home within her, the locked doors, the silences, the expectations. And no matter how far she traveled, even to the neon lights of New York, those footsteps continued to echo. As the child's footsteps fade down the corridor, we hear another sound, the creak of a closed door opening slowly, as though inviting us into the deeper chamber of her story. Beyond lies not only Edie's own struggle, but the accumulated tragedies of her family, a heritage of sorrow that shaped her path. To step through this door is to enter a room filled with silence, broken only by the fragile breaths of those who carry too much pain to speak aloud. The door creaks softly as it opens, revealing not an escape, but another passageway, one leading into the tender years of learning, where the outside world begins to shape the mind of the child. For Edie Sedgwick, school became a realm of both promise and difficulty, a place where she was set among others like herself in wealth and heritage, yet never quite at ease in her own skin. The walls of her family home had already taught her the language of silence and the weight of unspoken sorrows, and these lessons followed her into the classrooms of her youth. Her early schooling took place in the carefully chosen institutions of privilege, where children were prepared for the roles expected of them in a society that prized tradition and reputation. To outward eyes, Edie belonged there effortlessly, her family name carrying distinction, her appearance marked by a delicate charm. She was slender, graceful, and possessed of that peculiar light that drew others toward her. Teachers noticed her brightness, her ability to shine in certain moments with sudden intensity. Yet alongside this radiance, there existed fragility, a tendency toward mood and shadow that left her vulnerable. It is said that in those years, she was already marked by the beginnings of inner struggle. The control demanded at home had left its impression, and Edie, sensitive and searching, began to turn inward. Food became one of the battlegrounds where her need for control and her longing for freedom clashed. Restriction, illness, the strain of eating disorders entered her young life, pulling her into cycles of weakness and recovery that would follow her for years. Hospital stays were not unknown to her, even in adolescence, and the pattern of treatment and return began to etch itself into her story. Yet within this fragility lay an undeniable artistic spark. Edie found solace in drawing, in shaping forms on paper, in creating lines and images that expressed what words could not. Art became a refuge, a place where she could pour the restless energy that her family's silence denied. Perhaps it was here, in the quiet hours bent over sketches, that she began to form the language that would later make her presence so striking. For art, whether drawn on paper or lived through the body, became her way of communicating the turmoil and beauty she carried within. Her school years were also marked by a tension between belonging and isolation. Among her peers, she was both admired and apart. Some were drawn to her brightness, others unsettled by her unpredictability. She could be charming, quick to laughter, full of life, and yet moments later withdraw into silence, her gaze distant, as though she were elsewhere. This quality of being both present and absent, of dazzling in one instant and vanishing in the next, would become the very essence of her later allure in New York. But in these early years, it revealed itself as a child's attempt to balance worlds she could not reconcile. There's a certain image that emerges when we imagine her at school. Perhaps she is seated by a window, light falling across her face, a pencil in her hand. Outside, the grounds stretch neatly, filled with the order expected of such institutions. Inside, she is absorbed in a sketch, her mind wandering into shapes and lines that carry her away from the rigidity of lessons. The hum of her classmates fades, and she is both there and not there. In such moments, she crafted a private escape, a world that belonged only to her. But the body carries its own truths, and Edie's health remained fragile. The strains of her eating disorder weakened her, and she moved between moments of vitality and collapse. Doctors and hospitals entered her life with regularity, and the cycle of treatment became part of her growing identity. In those days, such illnesses were not well understood, and her struggles were often seen through the lens of weakness rather than suffering. For a girl already marked by her father's demands and her family's hidden tragedies, this misunderstanding added another layer of burden. And yet, even in the midst of these struggles, Edie displayed a spark that could not be extinguished. Her laughter, when it came, was quick and infectious. Her eyes, large and expressive, revealed an intensity that captivated those around her. She could charm effortlessly, her presence lifting a room in ways that surprised even herself. These qualities were not yet shaped into the icon she would become, but they were present, flickering like a candle in the wind. Her early education carried her between the structured halls of New England schools and the wide open spaces of California, each environment adding its own influence. The East Coast institutions placed her in the lineage of privilege and expectation, while the West reminded her of the land and the sky, of horses and open air. This duality, order and wilderness, tradition and escape, would remain with her throughout life. It was as though she was always suspended between confinement and freedom, never able to rest fully in either. At times, she found companionship among her peers, young women who were themselves navigating the complex roles laid before them. Yet even among friends, Edie often seemed distant, as if her thoughts and emotions were elsewhere. Her brother's struggles, the tensions of her home, the weight of her own illness, all of these accompanied her like shadows. She could not easily lay them aside, and so she remained both part of her world and removed from it. We may pause here and wonder, what was it in her that kept her moving forward despite these trials? Was it the promise of art, the glimmer of beauty that she carried within her? Or was it a restless search for love, for recognition, for a place where the burdens of silence would no longer follow? Perhaps it was both. In the corridors of her schools, in the quiet hours of sketching, in the cycles of illness and recovery, she was already preparing for the role she would one day inhabit. But these preparations were unconscious, woven from necessity rather than choice. A child does not choose her burdens, but she learns to survive them. And Edie survived by cultivating brightness, by finding ways to charm, to draw attention, to create an aura that distracted from the pain within. This gift would serve her in the factory, in the world of Warhol and cameras, but it was born here, in the silent wars of her youth. As she approached the end of her school years, the question of her future loomed. Would she follow the expected path of her family, entering into the circles of society prepared for her? Or would she seek another way, guided by her artistic leanings and her restless spirit? The answer was not yet clear. For the moment, she remained a young woman suspended between possibility and fragility, still more child than adult, yet already carrying the scars that would shape her life. The evening descends upon the grounds of her school. The windows glow faintly with the light of study lamps, and inside, Edie bends again over her sketchbook. Her hand moves quickly, as if urgency pressed upon her. Outside, the air grows colder, and the branches rustle against the glass. Within the quiet of that room, we glimpse the beginnings of a soul that would one day capture the gaze of a generation. Yet even in this moment of creation, shadows linger. The drawing is unfinished, lines trailing off into emptiness, as though the page itself could not contain all that she wished to express. The sketch remains incomplete, left upon the desk as the room grows darker. And from that unfinished page, we move forward, as though stepping through a window that opens into another world entirely, one filled with neon lights and the hum of the city, where the promise of escape waits just beyond reach. The unfinished sketch lies upon the desk, lines trailing into emptiness, and from that incomplete page, we pass through a window into another world. Beyond the glass, lights begin to glow, not with the soft warmth of a schoolroom, but with the restless pulse of a city. The sounds are sharper, the air heavy with a mixture of exhaust and promise. This is New York, where dreams and illusions intermingle, and where Edie Sedgwick would first encounter the possibility of escape from the confines of her family and the fragility of her youth. She arrived in the city carrying with her the burdens of her childhood, the scars of illness, and the hope of transformation. To leave California and New England behind was to step into a landscape of endless possibility. The city's avenues stretched like veins of light, the rhythm of traffic and voices a constant reminder that life here was never still. For a young woman hungry for freedom, New York shimmered with allure. Yet for one as fragile as Edie, its brilliance could just as easily overwhelm. The first impressions of the city are worth imagining. The clang of a subway car rumbling beneath the streets, the neon flicker of signs in Times Square, the scent of roasted chestnuts mingling with smoke on the cold air, and the endless faces streaming past. Each figure in the crowd carried a story, and Edie, with her wide eyes and searching heart, felt both lost among them and drawn to them. In a place where anonymity and visibility were constant companions, she hovered between the two, her presence unnoticed one moment and magnetic the next. In New York, she entered into circles shaped by art, fashion, and society. Her family name opened certain doors, while her beauty and charm pushed open others. Friends introduced her to the gatherings of the young and restless, parties that lasted into the early morning, apartments filled with music, smoke, and the mingling of voices hungry for expression. The city was alive with change. The early 60s carried with them a sense of breaking boundaries, of challenging old forms, of creating anew. For Edie, who had always longed for escape, this world was intoxicating. Yet beneath the excitement there was loneliness. The city can be merciless, its vastness swallowing those who arrive without anchor. Edie's fragile health and lingering sorrows followed her even here. Though she laughed, danced, and charmed, there remained in her a sense of distance, a sadness that could not be hidden entirely. Friends recalled how quickly her moods could shift, how in one moment she could be radiant and in the next withdrawn, her gaze unfocused, as though caught by some memory she could not escape. The artistic scene of New York drew her especially. Galleries, lofts, and gatherings of painters, poets, and filmmakers offered a world where the boundaries between life and art blurred. Here, Edie's fascination with image and performance found fertile ground. She had always used appearance as a way of navigating the world. Her fashion, her gestures, her laughter all carefully shaped to both attract and shield. In New York, this tendency deepened. She experimented with her look, with the sharp lines of eyeliner, the cropped hair that gave her face an almost childlike yet commanding presence, and the bold use of tights and short dresses that would become her signature. Fashion became for her not merely clothing, but a language, a way of announcing herself to the world while concealing the turbulence within. Observers spoke of how she seemed to embody the very spirit of the 60s, her style both rebellious and delicate, playful and defiant. Yet for Edie, fashion was not only expression, it was armor. Beneath the dazzling surface, the same fragility persisted. During these early months in the city, she also began to drift into the nightlife that would soon define much of her experience. Clubs where the music throbbed, where lights flickered in blues and reds, where strangers became companions in the hours before dawn. There was a sense of liberation in these spaces, where the strictures of family and society seemed to dissolve. Yet liberation often came hand in hand with substances that dulled pain and heightened illusion. Alcohol flowed freely, drugs circulated with ease, and for someone as vulnerable as Edie, these offerings became both comfort and trap. Still, in these days before her entanglement with Andy Warhol, there remained a quality of promise. New York had not yet consumed her. She was still a young woman seeking her place, still sketching, still experimenting, still caught between fragility and aspiration. Friends remembered her as both innocent and worldly, a contradiction that made her unforgettable. She seemed to belong to the city and yet remain untouched by it, like a figure caught between dream and waking. One evening, perhaps, she stood at the window of a small apartment in the city, the hum of traffic below, the glow of neon casting shifting colors across the glass. She watched the endless movement of people and lights, and for a moment, she felt herself part of something larger, something that might offer escape from the silence of her childhood. The sketch she had left unfinished in her schoolroom years seemed now to extend into the city itself, as though New York might become the page upon which she could finally complete her drawing. And yet, the lines remained uncertain. Each step forward carried with it both possibility and peril. The same openness that allowed her to shine also left her exposed. In the vastness of New York, where so many sought to reinvent themselves, Edie's radiance was both her gift and her danger. As the night deepens, the neon sign outside her window flickers, its hum filling the silence of her room. She turns away from the glass, her reflection momentarily doubled with the lights of the city. The sign continues to buzz and glow, its promise both alluring and empty. And it is in this glow, restless and uncertain, that her path leads onward, to a silver-walled studio where cameras never ceased, to the factory and to the strange, consuming gaze of Andy Warhol. The neon sign outside her window flickers, its glow humming softly into the room, and that restless vibration carries us forward into a place altogether stranger, a place where light itself was bent into spectacle. Through this hum, we step into the factory, Andy Warhol's silver-covered studio in Manhattan, where walls were lined with foil and light bulbs glared against chrome surfaces, turning the room into a cavern of reflections. Here, Edie Sedgwick would find not only a new world, but also the beginning of her most fateful bond. The factory was not like any other studio. It was at once a workshop, a gathering place, and a stage. Painters, poets, musicians, and wanderers drifted in and out, their voices mingling with the clatter of film cameras and the scratch of vinyl records spinning in the background. Warhol himself sat often at the center, quiet, pale, observing with eyes that seemed both detached and consuming. He recorded everything, transformed life itself into performance, blurring the line between art and existence. Those who entered his circle found themselves both elevated and reduced, illuminated by his gaze and yet diminished by it. Into this room stepped Edie, her presence immediately felt. Her cropped blonde hair, her striking eyes rimmed in dark liner, her slim figure clothed in black tights and short dresses. She seemed almost sculpted for this space of reflection. The silver walls magnified her, turned her into both subject and image, a living artwork that walked among the scattered canvases and film reels. Warhol, whose genius lay in turning people into icons, saw instantly what she carried. To him, she was not merely another visitor. She was a star waiting to be captured. The factory embraced her quickly. She became its brightest presence, arriving with laughter, with a cigarette in hand, with a kind of reckless vitality that filled the air. Cameras followed her, recording her movements, her words, her glances. Friends and strangers alike were drawn to her, mesmerized by the way she seemed to embody the moment itself. In those days, the factory was alive with experimentation, with films that blurred narrative and reality, with photographs that exalted the ordinary, with parties that stretched through the night. Edie was in the center of it, her image multiplying through Warhol's films and photographs, her name whispered in the city beyond. Yet what did she find there beneath the admiration? The factory was not a home, but a stage. Its silver walls reflected endlessly but embraced nothing. The laughter was loud, but it often masked emptiness. For Warhol, people became material, transformed into images and ideas, their inner lives secondary to the roles they played. Edie, fragile and searching, stepped willingly into this role, offering herself to the cameras, becoming the performance he required. But behind her bright gaze, the same sorrows lingered. The atmosphere of the factory was one of perpetual motion. Film reels clicked and whirred, flashes exploded from cameras, voices rose in argument or laughter, music pulsed from speakers, nights blended into days. In such a world, time lost its shape. Edie drifted through it like a flame, dazzling, flickering, unpredictable. Those around her adored her, yet many also exploited her, feeding on her presence, on the way she made every gathering shimmer with significance. Warhol, always careful, often maintained a distance, speaking in his flat tone, recording rather than participating. His fascination with Edie was genuine, but it was also impersonal. He saw in her an icon, a face that embodied the style and rebellion of the 60s. To him, she was a star, but stars were images, not people. For Edie, who longed for love and recognition, this distinction was perilous. She gave herself to the factory, but what she received was adoration of her image, not of her soul. Imagine her walking through those silver corridors, the foil crinkling faintly against the walls, the smell of paint and smoke hanging in the air. Her laughter rises, echoing, and cameras capture it. Yet when the laughter fades and she steps momentarily away from the crowd, what remains? Perhaps only the faint reflection of her own face in the shining wall, staring back at her with a gaze she can scarcely recognize. It is here that we glimpse the heart of her tragedy. In the factory, she was celebrated as a muse, transformed into an icon. But to be a muse is to serve another's vision, to be seen but not understood, to be consumed as image while the self remains unseen. For Edie, whose life had already taught her the pain of being overlooked in her own family, this dynamic was both familiar and destructive. The very place that seemed to free her from her past only deepened the silence within. Still, in these first months, there was exhilaration. New York recognized her. The magazines began to take notice. The nightlife called her name. She embodied a new style, one that countless others imitated. She was at once fragile and bold, innocent and daring. Her fashion, her gestures, her way of moving through a room, everything became part of the mythology that surrounded her. And for a time, it seemed as though she had escaped the shadows of her childhood. But the factory was never still. Its rhythm demanded constant performance, constant presence. The parties grew longer, the nights heavier, the substances more necessary. Edie, with her restless spirit and her unhealed wounds, leaned into the excess. Speed and other drugs became her companions, sharpening her brightness, masking her despair. The silver walls reflected her endlessly, but never offered her rest. The film reels whir in the background, cameras clicking without pause. In one corner, Warhol adjusts his wig, his eyes fixed upon Edie. She dances, speaks, laughs, collapses into a chair, rises again. Around her, others orbit, caught in her light. The factory is alive, and she is its heart. Yet even now, as the night stretches on, we feel a question lingering. How long can a flame burn so fiercely before it consumes itself? The whir of the film reel continues, steady and mechanical, as though indifferent to the lives it records. Its clicking carries us forward, deeper into the world where Edie will shine brighter still, and where the shadows that follow her will also deepen. The whir of the film reel continues, steady and indifferent, spooling light across silver walls, and in its clicking rhythm, Edie rises. She steps from shadow into image, and suddenly the city seems to see her everywhere. The factory, once a hidden chamber of experiment and play, now spills outward into magazines, parties, whispers, and headlines. And at its center stands Edie Sedgwick, the girl with cropped hair, enormous eyes lined in black, and legs sheathed in dark tights. To watch her was to feel the very pulse of the mid-60s. She was not simply another presence in Warhol's films. She became the symbol of his vision, his most luminous star. Her rise was startling in its swiftness. One moment she was another figure drifting among New York's restless youth, and the next she was an icon. Photographers clamored for her image. Journalists described her style. Designers whispered her name. Her clothing, once chosen with instinctive rebellion, became the blueprint for a generation of young women who wanted to escape the heavy dresses and decorum of the past. Black tights, short skirts, chandelier earrings that swung as she moved, cropped hair that revealed the delicate lines of her face, these became not merely her attire, but her signature. Edie did not just wear fashion, she embodied it. And yet her allure was not confined to clothing. There was something in the way she moved, in the restless tilt of her head, in the quickness of her laughter, that gave the impression of both fragility and command. She could enter a room and turn every gaze toward her, not through deliberate performance, but through the strange magnetism of someone who seemed simultaneously radiant and endangered. It was as though those who looked upon her sensed, even unconsciously, that she was burning faster than others, that her brightness came at a cost. Warhol, always keen to capture such qualities, placed her before his cameras again and again. In films such as Poor Little Rich Girl and Beauty No. 2, he framed her not as a traditional actress, but as a living artwork, her gestures and silences as significant as any script. The films were minimal, often little more than extended gazes, but they allowed her presence to unfold like a fragile performance of existence itself. She became, in Warhol's vision, both object and subject, a face projected larger than life, an image to be consumed. With this attention came a new kind of fame. She was invited to parties in grand apartments and fashionable clubs, where her laughter mingled with the music of the velvet underground and the endless chatter of New York society. She appeared on magazine pages, her photographs circulated, her name spoken as though it carried the very essence of the age. In the space of months, she had become the it girl of New York, the one others imitated, the one everyone wished to be near. But fame, as it so often does, carried shadows. For Edie, who had already learned to mask sorrow with performance, the attention offered both validation and emptiness. The world saw her, yes, but it saw her as image, as style, as symbol. The inner child who longed for love, the young woman who struggled with illness, the daughter of a family bound in silence, these remained unseen. And so the very fame that seemed to free her from obscurity also deepened her loneliness. The rhythm of her days grew ever more demanding. Parties stretched long into the night, photo shoots claimed her afternoons, films required her presence, and the factory continued its endless cycle of creation. To maintain her brightness, she leaned more heavily upon the substances that circulated freely within those circles. Amphetamines sharpened her, kept her awake, gave her the energy to dazzle. Cigarettes filled the silences, alcohol softened the edges, but each brought its own weight, and her body, already fragile, began to bear the strain. Yet to those around her, she seemed unstoppable. She was the darling of the scene, the jewel of Warhol's factory, the embodiment of 60s glamour. Her laughter, captured in photographs, seemed carefree. Her presence on film appeared eternal. But those who looked closer could see the signs of exhaustion, the trembling beneath the glitter, the moments when her eyes clouded with a sadness that no camera could disguise. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the nature of such fame. What does it mean to be celebrated as an icon? To be adored not for who one is, but for what one represents. For Edie, the adoration was intoxicating, but it was also hollow. Each flash of the camera both affirmed her presence and stripped away herself. She was seen everywhere, and yet she was unseen. Imagine her on one of those nights, seated in a club where the music pounds and the lights shift across the room. She leans back, cigarette in hand, her earrings catching the glow. Around her, people laugh, dance, speak loudly, their eyes darting toward her again and again. She smiles, she laughs, she joins the rhythm of the night. But then, for a moment, her gaze drifts beyond the room, beyond the laughter, as though she is looking for something not present there. A kind of longing rises in her expression, quickly hidden, but felt. It is the longing of someone who is adored, but not known. Her fame grew, but so did the intensity of her bond with Warhol. He placed her ever more at the center of his projects, naming her his superstar, encouraging her to live ever more fully in the role of muse and icon. For him, her presence was both inspiration and material, part of his larger exploration of fame, image, and artifice. For Edie, the role was both thrilling and destructive. To be his star was to be consumed by his vision, to surrender herself to his detached yet insistent gaze. And so the film reels continued to whir, the cameras to click, the flashbulbs to explode. Edie shone brighter than ever, her image multiplying across the city, her name whispered as legend. Yet beneath the brilliance, exhaustion deepened, shadows lengthened, and the first cracks began to appear in the facade. The flashbulbs explode once more, capturing her smile, and then, as the bulbs fade, darkness falls. It is in this moment between light and shadow that we follow her onward, into the depths of her bond with Warhol, a relationship that would define her and undo her in equal measure. The flashbulbs fade, leaving a momentary darkness in which only the echo of laughter remains, as though the night itself had exhaled. Out of this dimness emerges the strange and complicated bond between Edie Sedgwick and Andy Warhol, a relationship that has been recounted by many, yet remains elusive, never yielding its full truth. For what existed between them was not the clear bond of lovers, nor the steady trust of friends, but something else, something at once symbiotic and consuming, affectionate and cold, nurturing and destructive. Warhol saw in Edie a living masterpiece. To him, she was more than a young woman. She was a canvas, a performance, an image that embodied everything he sought to capture about fame and beauty in the 1960s. He crowned her his superstar, placing her in his films, surrounding her with his cameras, inviting her into the endless spectacle of the factory. He gave her visibility, exalted her presence, and turned her into the very symbol of his art. Yet in doing so, he also stripped away her humanity, treating her as though she were one of his silk screens, brilliant, iconic, yet endlessly reproducible. For Edie, the experience was intoxicating. To be singled out by Warhol, whose gaze seemed to transform the ordinary into legend, was to feel herself chosen, elevated, made immortal. In his presence, she was adored, photographed, immortalized on film. She became the focus of his world, and through him, the darling of New York's artistic scene. Yet beneath this exaltation lay a colder truth. Warhol's fascination was not one of intimacy, but of distance. He admired her image, not her soul. His affection was real, but it was the affection of an artist for his subject, not of a man for a woman. There were those who insisted that he loved her in his own way, that her fragility touched something in his detachment, that he felt protective of her brilliance. Others said he was indifferent, that he used her until her image was exhausted and then turned away. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps neither. What remains certain is that Edie longed for something more than he could offer. She sought not only visibility but love, not only recognition but understanding. And in Warhol's pale, watchful presence, she found only half of what she needed. Their relationship carried with it a strange rhythm. In public, she was always at his side, the jewel of his gatherings, the figure he presented to the world as his star. She accompanied him to parties, to openings, to studios, always dazzling, always drawing the gaze of others. He basked in her glow, and she in his. Yet in private, the warmth she craved was absent. Warhol was famously elusive, withholding affection, avoiding deep connection. For Edie, whose childhood had already taught her the pain of absence, this distance was both familiar and devastating. It is said that she adored him with a kind of devotion, seeing in him not only the artist, but also the figure who might finally anchor her drifting soul. But Warhol, whether by nature or design, remained distant, encouraging her to play the role of muse while never allowing her to step beyond it. In this imbalance lay the seed of their undoing. For Edie, the relationship offered both validation and emptiness, nourishment and hunger. She was adored as an icon, yet unseen as a woman. The ambiguity of their bond has led many to speculate. Was Warhol cruel, deliberately exploiting her fragility for his art? Or was he himself incapable of intimacy, bound by his own detachment, unable to give what she required? The truth, as always, lies in the shadow between. He was both fascinated and indifferent, both generous and withholding. He gave her fame but not love, visibility but not care. And she, in her longing, accepted the illusion as though it might one day transform into reality. Imagine them together in the factory, Warhol seated quietly, his tape recorder running, his gaze fixed on her as she speaks, laughs, gestures, her words tumbling in streams of wit and melancholy. Around them, others drift in and out, but his eyes rarely leave her. To him, she is the perfect subject, her presence itself the art he seeks to capture. She, seeing his gaze, feels momentarily chosen, lifted above the crowd. Yet when the reel stops, when the camera clicks off, the moment dissolves, and the distance returns. For Edie, this cycle was both thrilling and exhausting. She poured herself into the role of Warhol's star, giving him her time, her energy, her very being. But the more she gave, the more she felt the emptiness grow. Behind her laughter lay exhaustion, behind her brilliance a quiet despair, and yet she could not step away, for the factory had become both her home and her prison, Warhol both her benefactor and her captor. In the broader world, their bond was the subject of fascination. Magazines wrote of them, society whispered about them, the city saw them as inseparable. Together they represented a new kind of glamour. Strange, detached, dazzling, and haunting. Yet those who looked closely could see the cracks. Edie's health was faltering, her reliance on drugs deepening, her moods shifting ever more wildly. And Warhol, always detached, seemed unwilling or unable to intervene. There is a haunting quality in this dynamic. To be adored as a muse, to be exalted as a star, and yet to remain unseen as a person. Is this not the very essence of tragedy? Edie gave herself to Warhol's vision, and in doing so, lost herself. He, in turn, immortalized her image, but allowed the woman herself to fade. Their bond was both creation and destruction, both intimacy and abandonment. As the night at the factory drifts on, we hear the sound of a camera being lifted, a shutter poised to click. A hand reaches for it, hesitating, as though uncertain whether to capture the moment or let it dissolve into memory. And in that hesitation, we step onward into the next chamber of her story, where the hunger for escape deepens, and the presence of drugs begins to blur the line between brightness and shadow. The hand lingers above the camera, uncertain, and then withdraws, leaving the moment unrecorded. What is not captured on film remains only in memory, blurred and fleeting, like smoke dissolving into air. And it is smoke, indeed, that begins to fill the rooms around Edie Sedgwick, mingling with the sharp scent of chemicals and the faint sweetness of perfume. The factory, once a place of playful experiment, shifts into something heavier, its rhythms marked not only by art, but by the growing presence of drugs that blurred reality into haze. Speed, the drug of restless nights, entered Edie's life with the deceptive promise of energy. Small white pills taken in the morning, in the afternoon, in the hours when fatigue threatened to break her brilliance, gave her a sharpness of presence, a vitality that seemed to match the endless demands of Warhol's circle. With speed, she could stay awake, stay thin, stay dazzling. Conversations quickened, gestures sharpened, laughter erupted more easily. The factory thrived on such acceleration, the blurring of days into nights, the collapse of ordinary time into a perpetual now. And Edie, already fragile, surrendered herself to it. At first, the effect seemed miraculous. She was tireless, always present, always radiant. She flitted from party to party, from film set to photo shoot, from gathering to gathering, her voice quick, her body in constant motion. The silver walls of the factory caught her in fragments, each reflection as vivid as the last. Yet beneath the surface, her body grew weaker, her nerves frayed, her spirit unsettled. Speed gave energy, but it stole balance. It sharpened the edges of her charm while hollowing out the depths of her being. The atmosphere of the factory in those days was one of constant motion. Cameras whirred without pause, tape recorders clicked on and on, voices overlapped in manic streams of talk, and the night seemed to stretch without end. Cigarette smoke hung heavy, mingling with the smell of coffee, alcohol, and sweat. On the walls, silver foil shimmered under the harsh bulbs, reflecting each movement in fragments. To step into this space was to feel suspended in unreality, as though life itself had become a film that never ceased. In such a world, Edie's brightness became both necessity and spectacle. Those who surrounded her fed upon her presence, delighted in her quick wit, her glamorous gestures, the way she seemed to embody the very essence of the moment. She spoke rapidly, her thoughts spilling out in bursts, her laughter echoing. And yet, those who looked closely could see the strain beneath. Her eyes, wide and rimmed in black, sometimes carried a glassy sheen. Her body, always slender, grew frailer. The constant rhythm of stimulation left her restless, unable to rest even when the night finally grew quiet. There's a cruel paradox in this. The very substance that gave her the ability to dazzle, to keep pace with the factory's relentless rhythm, also eroded the core of her strength. Each pill carried with it a fleeting gift and a hidden theft. She gained energy, but she lost peace. She gained brilliance, but she lost stability. And in this trade, her spirit began to fracture further. The nights grew longer, the mornings harsher. Parties bled into one another, laughter mingled with quarrels, and the boundaries between performance and reality blurred. The factory had always been a stage, but now it became also a refuge for those who sought to escape the weight of sobriety, the pain of silence, the demands of ordinary life. Edie was both participant and symbol of this escape. She embodied the glamour of excess, the beauty of reckless freedom, and yet she also revealed its cost. Imagine her seated on a battered sofa, legs folded beneath her, cigarette between her fingers, speaking rapidly as others gathered close, entranced by her every word. Her earrings swing with each gesture, her laughter bursts forth, her sentences dart and leap, carried by the quick fire of amphetamines. Around her, the room hums with energy, voices overlapping, music blaring, film reels spinning. Yet when the laughter fades, when her body slumps momentarily, when her gaze drifts into distance, one sees the exhaustion, the fragility, the sorrow that no substance can erase. Warhol watched all this with his usual detachment. He recorded, he observed, he included her in his films, delighted in her as his star. But he did not intervene. To him, the chaos was part of the art, the collapse inseparable from the performance. Edie's decline, even as it became more visible, remained material for his work. He admired her, but from a distance. He gave her space to shine, but not support to heal. And so the factory, with its shimmering walls and endless nights, became both stage and trap. Edie, once a child sketching quietly in schoolrooms, now lived in a world where sleep was rare, where silence was filled with chatter, where every moment was recorded, yet nothing truly remembered. The unfinished sketch of her youth now seemed to dissolve entirely, its lines scattered in fragments of film reels, photographs, and half-forgotten parties. Speed sharpened her presence, but it also accelerated her collapse. Those who knew her began to notice the changes. She grew thinner, more restless, more volatile. Her mood swung sharply, her laughter sometimes giving way to sudden silence, her energy collapsing into exhaustion. And yet she remained magnetic. Even as she unraveled, people could not look away. She embodied the beauty of a flame flickering against the wind, its brilliance undeniable, its fragility evident. It is tempting to ask, did she know in those moments that the very substance that kept her alive in the scene was also leading her toward destruction? Did she recognize the cost of each pill, or was the promise of escape too strong to resist? Perhaps she knew, and perhaps she did not. For those who live in the haze of such nights, the boundaries of knowledge blur. The desire to keep going, to keep shining, outweighs the warnings of tomorrow. The sound of a lighter sparks, the flame catching briefly before fading into smoke. It drifts upward, curling against the silver wall, dissolving into the air. And in that rising smoke, we follow her further, into the next chamber of her story, where relationships beyond Warhol, fleeting, destructive, and longing for permanence, would entwine themselves with her fragile search for love. The smoke curls upward against the silver wall, twisting into shapes that dissolve as quickly as they appear. And in that fragile rising, we follow Edie into another realm of her story, one not confined to cameras and film reels, but bound instead to the restless pursuit of intimacy. For beyond her place as Warhol's star, she sought companionship in men who promised affection but often delivered pain. And in these entanglements, her longing for love echoed like footsteps in an empty room. Edie's presence, luminous and fragile, attracted admirers constantly. She moved through circles of artists, musicians, and wealthy socialites, each drawn to her brightness as though to a flame. Men saw in her different things. Some saw a muse, others a conquest, others still a childlike figure in need of protection. But few, if any, saw her fully. Her radiance was always visible, her vulnerability often concealed, her deeper sorrow rarely understood. And so, one by one, the relationships she entered became fleeting shadows, leaving her more lonely than before. Among the most spoken of was her bond with Bob Dylan, a connection shrouded in rumor, memory, and speculation. Whether or not their relationship was truly romantic has been debated for decades, but what remains clear is that she admired him deeply. Dylan, with his songs of rebellion and his enigmatic presence, embodied the restless spirit of the 1960s. To Edie, he must have seemed both anchor and escape, a man whose words carried the possibility of truth in a world of illusion. Yet Dylan's world was complicated, entangled with others, and whatever closeness they shared soon dissolved into distance. For Edie, the sense of abandonment deepened. To be left behind by a figure she admired so profoundly echoed the silences of her childhood, reviving old wounds. There were others, too, actors, painters, men of wealth and promise, each drawn to her light, each leaving her diminished. Some relationships were brief flares of passion, others lingered in more destructive patterns. Friends recalled her as someone who gave herself quickly, perhaps too quickly, as though she hoped that love might fill the void left by silence and loss. Yet again and again, she was left searching. The hollow room echoed back only her own longing. The culture of the factory and the city in those years offered little stability. Love was often fleeting, entanglements transient, promises broken as easily as they were made. Within this atmosphere, Edie's vulnerability was heightened. She was a woman who craved permanence in a world that offered only the temporary. Each romance became a fragile hope, each ending a deeper wound. And the drugs, already woven into her daily life, blurred her perception further, making it difficult to distinguish genuine affection from illusion. There's a haunting image in imagining her seated by a telephone, the city's noise drifting faintly through the window, her cigarette burning slowly as she waits for a call that does not come. The laughter of the night before still lingers in her memory, the promise of companionship spoken in hurried words. But the telephone remains silent, its metal body cold against the table, the stillness of the room pressing in. Such moments must have repeated, each silence amplifying her sense of being unseen, despite all the eyes that adored her in public. Her need for love was not shallow, nor was it merely the desire for attention. It was something deeper, rooted in her earliest years, when affection was withheld, when silence replaced tenderness, when her father's authority left no room for vulnerability. To be loved, for Edie, was to be recognized in her entirety, not as image but as person. Yet the men who entered her life rarely saw beyond the surface. They admired her beauty, her style, her charm, but they did not reach into the shadows that shaped her, and so the cycle continued. Adoration, entanglement, abandonment, despair. Each relationship left her more fragile, more reliant on substances to numb the pain, more entangled in the illusions of nightlife. Her friends watched as she drifted further, her laughter louder and quicker, her collapses sharper and more painful. To those who loved her, it was heartbreaking to witness. To the city at large, it remained hidden, her image still glittering in photographs and films, even as her private world collapsed. The loneliness of her nights was masked by the excess of her days. She moved from one party to another, one lover to another, one moment to the next, always in search of something lasting, always finding only the temporary. The hollow echo grew louder, until even the glamour could not disguise it. We may ask ourselves here, was she searching for love, or was she searching for herself within love? Did she hope that the reflection in another's eyes might finally reveal her true self, the one hidden beneath layers of performance? Perhaps both. For Edie, love was not simply desire, it was survival, the hope that someone might anchor her in a world that seemed to dissolve around her. Yet the anchors never held. Each slipped away, leaving her adrift. And with each departure, her reliance on the factory, on Warhol, on speed and smoke, grew heavier. Her relationships, rather than rescuing her, deepened her entrapment. She became more entangled in the performance of glamour, even as her spirit crumbled. The telephone remains on the table, its silence profound. The cigarette burns down, ash falling softly onto the floor. Outside, the city continues its endless rhythm, indifferent to her waiting. And from that unanswered ring, we move onward, carried by its echo into another chamber of her story, one that would lead her westward, toward Hollywood, where the illusions of film would promise salvation and deliver only deeper disillusion. The telephone rests silent on the table, its unanswered call a hollow weight in the room. And from that silence we turn westward, following Edie as she sought another kind of stage. Beyond New York's neon lights and silver walls, Hollywood shimmered with its own promises, ancient in their seduction. It was said that in the glow of film, one might find immortality, that the screen could capture what flesh could not hold, that the star's light could never be extinguished. For Edie Sedgwick, already adorned with the title of Warhol's superstar, Hollywood seemed both a natural step and a fragile hope. The journey carried her away from the smoke-filled factory and into the California sun, a return to her native state, yet with new illusions in hand. The hills of Los Angeles rolled golden in the late light, their silence so different from the pounding clubs of New York. But beneath the palm trees and the glittering marquees, Hollywood carried its own shadowed hunger, a world where faces were consumed as quickly as they were discovered, where promises were made only to vanish. Edie entered this landscape like a flame already flickering, dazzling in her presence, fragile in her core. Producers and filmmakers, always alert to the new and the strange, saw in her an image that could ignite the screen. She carried with her the aura of Warhol's factory, the it girl of Manhattan, the embodiment of a new fashion, a new rebellion. In the age when old Hollywood glamour was crumbling and youth culture was reshaping the world, Edie seemed a perfect emblem. Her eyes wide and searching, her pixie-cut hair, her swift movements, all suggested something at once modern and timeless. She was courted for roles, considered for films, spoken of in whispers as a star in the making. And yet Hollywood required something different from what Warhol had demanded. In Warhol's films, Edie could be herself, fragmented, luminous, simply existing before the camera. Hollywood asked for control, for scripts, for discipline, for a steadiness of presence that her fragile spirit could not always provide. The very qualities that made her magnetic in the factory, the unpredictability, the flickering between brilliance and absence, proved difficult to harness on a traditional set. Her charm was undeniable, but it slipped through the structures of film like water through a sieve. Behind the scenes, her struggles followed her. The reliance on speed and other substances, the exhaustion from endless nights, the wounds of failed relationships, all accompanied her westward. Friends in Los Angeles recalled her as radiant in moments, yet erratic, her moods quick to turn, her energy often collapsing. She arrived with the aura of fame, but without the grounding that might have allowed her to endure. Hollywood, merciless in its demands, sensed the instability. Promises of roles dissolved, meetings faded, and the golden door that had seemed to open before her soon began to close. Still, there were flashes of her brilliance. Screen tests captured her presence, revealing that peculiar combination of innocence and danger that had always defined her. In those brief moments on film, one sees the possibility of what she might have been had her life allowed steadiness. Her voice, delicate yet insistent, her eyes shifting between vulnerability and command, she carried something unique, something that could not be manufactured. But uniqueness is not always enough. In a world where stars were shaped by control and machinery, her unpredictability was both gift and liability. The disillusionment came quickly. Hollywood, for all its glamour, offered no shelter. Its parties mirrored those of New York, filled with glitter, intoxication, and the endless pursuit of novelty. The studios, pragmatic and demanding, withdrew when her fragility became evident. The city, with its wide roads and palm-lined avenues, held no anchor for her. She drifted from gathering to gathering, her laughter echoing, her presence admired, yet her opportunities slipping away like sand through open hands. Imagine her standing beneath the bright marquee of a theater on Hollywood Boulevard, the neon lights spelling names larger than life. The air smells faintly of popcorn and exhaust. Voices rise from the street, and above, the stars of California glitter faintly in the night sky. For a moment, she looks up, her earrings catching the neon glow, her smile radiant. She seems to belong there, as though her name, too, might appear in lights. But the marquee does not hold her, and the promise of immortality slips past. The crowd moves on, the lights continue to glow, and she is left again in the shadows. This brief excursion westward did not rescue her. It did not heal the wounds carried from her family, nor did it soothe the hollowness left by failed love. Instead, it added another layer of disappointment, another reminder that the image others adored was not the same as the self within. To Warhol, she had been muse. To New York, she had been icon. To Hollywood, she became possibility unfulfilled. Each role demanded her surface. None offered her substance. The clash between image and reality grew sharper. On screen, she was luminous, yet off-screen, she faltered. In public, she was admired. In private, she unraveled. Hollywood, like New York, fed upon the image while ignoring the woman. And Edie, fragile and longing, could not bridge the gap. Her descent, already visible, quickened in these days as the illusions of film dissolved into the reality of her dependence on substances, her erratic presence, her despair. It is here that we see the cruel rhythm of her life, each promise rising like a bright flame, each collapsing into smoke. The factory had exalted her, then consumed her. Hollywood had beckoned her, then discarded her. And through it all, she continued to burn, her brilliance undeniable, her destruction inevitable. The film projector clicks once, then stops, the reel finished, the light fading from the screen. In that sudden silence, we move onward, carried by the sound of footsteps receding into rain-slick streets, as Edie drifts away from Warhol and the factory, the fracture between them deepening into exile. Footsteps echo across the rain-slick streets, fading slowly into the night, and it is upon this sound that we follow Edie Sedgwick as she drifts further from the silver walls of the factory. What had once been the center of her existence, the stage upon which she glittered as Warhol's brightest star, now becomes a place of estrangement. The fracture between them, born of distance and detachment, widens with each passing week until silence replaces laughter and exile replaces belonging. At first, the separation was subtle. Whispers in corners missed invitations, a cooler tone in Warhol's voice. The factory, always restless, had begun to turn toward new figures, new muses, new stars to capture its endless hunger for novelty. Warhol, whose detachment was both his armor and his cruelty, shifted his gaze. For Edie, who had given herself wholly to his vision, the change was devastating. She had been his superstar, the jewel of his creation, and now she found herself fading from the center, replaced by others who brought fresh energy to the circle. Some say it was inevitable. Warhol's genius lay in capturing the moment, and the moment was always passing. To remain at the center of his world was to remain perpetually new, perpetually dazzling. And no one, not even Edie with her rare magnetism, could sustain such brilliance forever. Others insist there was betrayal, that she had expected more from him, that his coldness in the face of her decline revealed a heart unwilling to care for the very souls he had exalted. Whatever the truth, the effect on Edie was clear. She felt abandoned, discarded, left behind by the man who had crowned her a star. The bitterness of this exile was sharpened by her own fragility. She had leaned heavily on the factory for identity, for belonging, for validation. To be Warhol's star was to be someone, to be adored, to be seen. To Without that role, she was once again adrift, her childhood silences echoing louder than ever. She sought comfort in substances, in fleeting romances, in the restless pace of the city, but none of these could fill the void left by her fracture with Warhol. Imagine her one evening, walking alone through the streets of Manhattan, the rain falling lightly, the neon reflections shimmering across the wet pavement. The sounds of the city surround her, cars hissing through puddles, voices rising from bars, the distant wail of a siren. She pulls her coat tightly around her, her cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. The laughter of the factory, the hum of the film reels, the presence of Warhol, all seem distant now, like a dream from which she is woken too soon. She is still recognized, still whispered about, but no longer celebrated as before. The exile is both public and private. Her attempts to rebuild herself faltered. Hollywood had offered only disappointment. Warhol had turned away. The relationships she sought for comfort proved fragile, often exploitative. The glitter that had once seemed to cover her wounds now slipped away, leaving them exposed. Her dependence on speed deepened. Her health grew frailer. Her finances dwindled. The very fame that had once lifted her now seemed to haunt her, for she could not escape the image the world still expected her to embody. Warhol, for his part, rarely spoke of her directly. His detachment made him elusive, his words about her often ambiguous, delivered in the same flat tone with which he described all things. To some, this was cruelty. To others, it was simply his nature. But for Edie, the silence was deafening. She had once been the center of his gaze, and now she was invisible to him. The betrayal cut deep, for she had not only given him her image, she had given him her trust, her hope that his attention might mean love. In its absence, she was left with nothing. The fracture with Warhol became symbolic of a larger collapse. She was no longer the icon of the factory, no longer the star of New York's restless scene. Others had taken her place, and she was left to wander in the margins, her presence still magnetic but her stability gone. Those who encountered her in these years often described her as radiant yet broken, her beauty undiminished, but her spirit fraying. She would appear at parties, dazzling for an hour, only to disappear into the shadows soon after. Her laughter, once effortless, now carried an edge of desperation. We might ask, did Warhol know what he had done? Did he understand the weight of his distance, the cost of his detachment? Or was his art, with its relentless hunger for novelty, incapable of such reflection? Perhaps he knew, and perhaps he did not. The truth is that in the factory, all relationships were subject to the demands of artifice. To be a muse was to be both exalted and discarded, to be transformed into image and then abandoned once the image no longer held power. Edie, fragile and longing, had not the strength to survive this cycle. The rain continues to fall on the pavement, the footsteps receding into darkness. In this sound we hear the measure of her exile, the loneliness of a woman once adored by all, now left to wander through the city's endless night. And from these footsteps we move forward, following her as the silence deepens, as the glitter fades entirely, as her descent into addiction and despair grows heavier, each day more difficult to bear. The footsteps fade into silence, swallowed by the night, and from that hush emerges the next passage of Edie's life, a descent marked not by glitter or applause, but by the slow erosion of all that once sustained her. The fracture with Warhol left her untethered, her image still haunting the city, but her presence diminished. The factory had been both her stage and her anchor, and without it she drifted, her days blurring into nights, her nights dissolving into haze. What had once been brilliance now slipped into collapse, her spirit weighed down by substances that promised relief but offered only ruin. Addiction had been present before, but now it grew heavier, more insistent, a constant companion. Speed, alcohol, and later heroin filled the spaces where love and belonging had failed her. At first they dulled the pain, quickened her step, allowed her to maintain the illusion of brightness. But soon they consumed her, eroding her body, clouding her mind, tightening their grip until escape seemed impossible. Friends who had once adored her began to step back, unable to bear the sight of her decline, unwilling to be pulled into her unraveling. Isolation deepened, and the silence of her childhood seemed to return, now magnified by despair. Her finances, once supported by family wealth and the opportunities of fame, dwindled. The glamour of New York was expensive, and without steady work or Warhol's patronage, she found herself increasingly desperate. Belongings were sold, debts mounted, and the security of her past slipped away. Those who still cared for her watched helplessly, for Edie's charm could still ignite a room, but behind the radiance lay exhaustion. She was both luminous and broken, captivating and fragile, a woman burning at both ends. The parties she attended in these years carried a different tone. No longer was she the star around which the night revolved. Instead, she appeared like a ghost of her former self, still beautiful, still magnetic, but thinner, wearier. Her laughter edged with despair. Conversations grew slurred, her movements less steady. Yet even in this state, people could not look away. She embodied a tragic allure, a beauty entwined with decay, a flame flickering desperately against the wind. There were moments when she seemed to fight against the descent. Hospital stays, brief attempts at recovery, promises to herself and others that she would find her footing again. For a time she would emerge brighter, steadier, her eyes clearer. But the cycle returned swiftly, the substances calling, the despair overwhelming. Each attempt at healing seemed to dissolve into relapse, leaving her weaker than before. The pattern became a cruel rhythm, as though her very life were caught in a loop of hope and collapse. The mirror, once her ally in shaping her image, now became a source of pain. Her face, still delicate, began to show the toll of exhaustion. The sparkle in her eyes dulled, her body grew frailer, her movements less sure. To look at herself was to confront the gap between the image the world still carried of her, the dazzling star of the factory, and the reality of her decline. In moments of honesty, she must have seen this gap and felt its weight, the crushing knowledge that the icon she had been could no longer be sustained. And yet those who spoke with her in private often remarked that her soul still flickered with brightness. She remained witty, insightful, capable of sudden bursts of warmth that revealed the woman she might have been had her circumstances been kinder. In such moments one glimpsed the child who had sketched alone in her schoolroom, the young woman who had dreamed of love and art, the spirit that had captivated Warhol's camera. But these glimpses grew rarer, buried beneath layers of exhaustion and haze. The silence of her exile from Warhol haunted her. Though she rarely spoke of him directly, his absence lingered like an unhealed wound. She had given him her brilliance, and he had turned away. The betrayal, whether intentional or not, deepened her despair. Without his gaze, she felt invisible. Without the factory, she felt unmoored. Her identity, once bound to the image of Warhol's superstar, now dissolved, leaving her with nothing but fragments of memory and the hollow comfort of substances. We may pause here and ask, was her collapse inevitable, or could it have been prevented? Was she simply too fragile, too wounded by her family's silence and Warhol's detachment to survive the demands of fame? Or was she abandoned by those who might have helped her, left to wither while others turned away? The answers remain uncertain, hidden within the shadows of her story. What is clear is that her descent was both personal and cultural, the reflection of a generation that exalted brilliance while discarding those who could not endure its pace. Imagine her in a dim apartment, the curtains drawn, the air thick with smoke. A mirror hangs crooked on the wall, its surface cracked. She sits before it, her face pale, her eyes distant, her hands trembling slightly as she lights another cigarette. The room is quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock, each second marking her drift further from the life she once knew. The crack in the mirror multiplies her reflection, fragmenting her face into pieces. It is as though the image she once embodied has shattered, leaving only shards of what had been. The mirror cracks, and the shards scatter across the floor, catching the dim light as they fall. In that scattering, we follow her further, into the next passage of her story, when she leaves New York behind and returns westward, seeking in California the possibility of healing, though the ghosts of her childhood still wait among the eucalyptus trees. The shards of the mirror scatter across the floor, catching what little light remains in the dim room, and in their sharp glimmers we turn westward once more, following Edie as she left New York behind. The city that had crowned her an icon had also abandoned her, and its endless nights offered only exhaustion and despair. California, her birthplace, seemed to whisper of another possibility, a return to something simpler, perhaps even to healing. The wide skies and eucalyptus groves of Santa Barbara waited with their familiar stillness, promising rest, though the ghosts of her childhood lingered in every shadow. To return home is always to confront what one sought to escape. For Edie, the land of her youth carried both beauty and pain. The ranches stretched across rolling hills, horses moved slowly in the distance, and the ocean's winds drifted over the earth with a gentleness that New York had never known. Yet beneath this tranquility lay the memories of her father's harsh authority, her family's silences, and the tragedies of her brothers. California was not only her refuge, it was also the origin of her wounds. Her family welcomed her, though their ability to understand her struggles was limited. The Sedgwicks had long been burdened by mental illness and sorrow, and compassion, though present, was often tangled with shame and restraint. They wished for her recovery, yet they did not always know how to offer it. Hospitals and clinics in the region became part of her life once again. She entered treatment facilities where doctors attempted to steady her, prescribing therapies, medications, and periods of enforced sobriety. For a time, she responded. Her body gained strength, her laughter grew more natural, her eyes cleared. There were even moments when it seemed she might begin anew. The California landscape itself seemed to soothe her in these brief intervals of stability. She rode horses again, the smell of hay and dust rising in the barns, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying her across fields. She walked among eucalyptus groves, their tall trunks swaying, their leaves releasing a sharp, clean scent when crushed beneath her feet. The air was open, the horizon wide, the silence profound. For someone who had lived in the relentless pace of New York, the contrast was striking. It was as though nature itself attempted to offer her a balm. And yet the past was never far away. The same corridors she had walked as a child remained, the same rooms where silence had weighed so heavily. Her father's voice, though softer now with age, still carried authority. Her mother, graceful but withdrawn, still hovered at the edges, unable to break free of old patterns. Her siblings, each in their own way, bore the marks of the family's tragedies. The house was filled not only with memories, but with the living presence of sorrow. To recover within such a place was difficult, for each step forward was shadowed by echoes of the past. The culture of treatment in those years was itself imperfect. Mental health and addiction were poorly understood, and methods often relied on control rather than compassion. Edie endured cycles of institutionalization, weeks in hospital wards, months in clinics, followed by releases that promised renewal but often ended in relapse. The pattern was wearying, both for her and for those around her. Hope rose, only to collapse again. The candle flame flickered, always threatening to extinguish, always sparking back into light just when darkness seemed final. Still, there were moments when she seemed genuinely to believe in the possibility of healing. She spoke of wanting stability, of longing for a quieter life, of wishing to free herself from the chains of addiction. Her charm and brightness remained, even through the haze. Visitors to the family ranch recalled evenings when she sat at the piano, her fingers touching the keys softly, her voice rising in laughter that seemed, for an instant, untouched by sorrow. These glimpses revealed the woman she might have been, had the wounds of her past and the weight of her fame not borne down so heavily. Yet the ghosts returned, as they always did. Loneliness haunted her. The image of her younger self standing in the corridors of her childhood home seemed to walk beside her even in adulthood. The authority of her father, the tragedies of her brothers, the silence of her mother, all lingered, woven into her being. California, though calmer than New York, could not erase what had been inscribed in her from the beginning. We may ask here, is it ever possible to return to the place of one's origin and be healed by it? Or does the soil of our youth always carry the imprint of our wounds? For Edie, the answer seemed to tilt toward the latter. The land was beautiful, yes, and at times it gave her peace, but it was also filled with memories that sharpened her pain. To return home was not to escape, but to confront, and she was too fragile to bear the confrontation for long. Imagine her walking alone across the ranch at dusk, the hills darkening, the smell of eucalyptus rising in the cooling air. Her figure, slight against the vast horizon, moves slowly, her steps uneven. She pauses by a fence, resting her hands on the wood, her gaze distant. The wind lifts her hair, carrying with it both comfort and sorrow. In that moment, she seems suspended between two worlds, the possibility of renewal and the inevitability of collapse. The wind rustles through the eucalyptus trees, their tall trunks swaying gently, their leaves whispering like voices from the past. In that rustling, we follow her further into the next passage of her story, when the fragile balance of recovery and relapse would play out again and again, her spirit flickering like a candle flame against the winds of despair. The eucalyptus leaves whisper in the evening air, their murmurs like voices half-remembered, and in their restless sound we follow Edie Sedgwick deeper into the rhythm that now defined her life, a rhythm of recovery and relapse, of hope flickering and shadows returning. California had offered her brief moments of calm, but calm is not the same as healing. The ghosts of her past walked beside her, and the wounds of her present refused to close. What remained was a life oscillating between institutions and freedom, each promising renewal, each delivering exhaustion. Hospitals became a constant presence, their white walls enclosing her as though in a fragile shell. Nurses observed her with careful eyes, doctors prescribed treatments, routines structured her days. For a time, this order steadied her. Removed from the relentless temptations of parties and substances, she gained strength. Her cheeks filled with color again, her eyes brightened, her laughter returned in short bursts that revealed the woman she might still become. Visitors sometimes left convinced that she was on the path to recovery. She herself spoke of new beginnings, of wanting to live differently, of longing for stability. But hospitals cannot contain the longings of the heart. They may heal the body temporarily, but they cannot banish the loneliness that drives a spirit toward escape. And for Edie, that loneliness was profound. Released from institutional care, she would return to familiar places, familiar faces, and the old patterns would draw her in once more. The cycle resumed, brief stability, followed by relapse, followed by collapse. Each return to treatment carried with it the weight of previous failures, until even hope began to feel like another burden. The candle flame flickered. At times it grew bright, steadying against the wind, illuminating her features with warmth. At other times it wavered, nearly extinguished, smoke curling upward as though in farewell. Those who loved her learned to live in the tension between these states, never certain whether the Edie they encountered would be radiant with energy or fragile with despair. To witness her was to see both brilliance and fragility, inseparable, entwined like light and shadow. There were moments when she spoke with clarity about her condition. She knew the dangers of her addictions, knew the patterns of her relapses, knew the toll it took on her family. She wanted to break free, to carve a life beyond the cycles. Yet wanting is not the same as being able. Her spirit, though luminous, was also weakened by years of silence, by the weight of expectation, by the betrayals of love and fame. Each relapse seemed to whisper that escape was impossible, that the shadows would always return. Her family, too, struggled. They wished to support her, but their own wounds limited their capacity. The Sedgwick household was already heavy with sorrow, already strained by tragedy. Edie's struggles, though not unique among her siblings, carried the weight of visibility, for her fame had placed her in the public eye. To care for her meant not only to tend to her needs, but also to navigate the gaze of a world that still remembered her as Warhol's star. The contrast between the icon the world adored and the fragile woman they embraced at home was painful, even unbearable at times. And yet, for all the difficulty, there remained tenderness. Friends recalled her capacity for warmth, her ability to delight others with sudden bursts of wit, her laughter that rang with sincerity even in the midst of sorrow. These qualities did not disappear. They flickered, reappearing unexpectedly, reminding those around her of the person she truly was beneath the haze. To witness these glimpses was to be both comforted and pained, for they revealed the depth of her potential, even as they highlighted the tragedy of her decline. The candle flame wavered especially in her relationships. Even in California, she sought love, sought connection, sought someone who might anchor her against the winds. But the patterns repeated. Bonds formed quickly, often with intensity, but dissolved just as swiftly. The men she drew into her life admired her beauty, her fragility, her legend, but they rarely offered the stability she needed. Each failed relationship deepened the cycle, reinforcing the loneliness that drove her back towards substances. Love, which might have healed, instead became another arena of disappointment. We may pause here to reflect. Is the human spirit like a candle, destined to flicker and fade when the winds are too strong? Or is it more resilient, capable of burning steadily even in storm? For Edie, the question remained unanswered. Her spirit flickered with resilience. Yes, but the winds of her life, family wounds, fame's betrayals, addiction's grip were relentless. And so the flame wavered, never fully extinguished, never fully steady. Imagine her in a hospital ward at night, the lights dimmed, the sound of footsteps echoing faintly in the hall. She lies awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her thoughts restless. The faint glow of a candle left by a sympathetic nurse flickers on the table beside her bed. She watches it dance, its light unsteady, its flame fragile. In that flicker, she sees herself, suspended between survival and collapse, her future uncertain. The candle burns through the night, wavering but enduring, a companion in her solitude. But the winds do not relent. Each release from treatment carried her back into the world, and each return to the world brought her once more to the edge. The oscillation grew wearying, the hope of healing more fragile with each cycle. By the time she reached her mid-20s, she had lived a lifetime's worth of collapse and renewal, each leaving her weaker, each marking her body and spirit more deeply. The candle flame wavers once more, bending low, then rising again, then nearly extinguishing. In that trembling light, we move forward toward the fragile attempt at stability she sought in marriage, a bond that carried with it both promise and inevitability, a quiet hope for shelter that flickered like the flame itself. The candle flame wavers, bending low, then rising again, as though undecided between survival and surrender. And in that trembling light, we follow Edie into the fragile shelter she sought in marriage. It was in 1971, after years of collapse and recovery, that she wed Michael Post, a young man whose presence seemed to offer her a steadiness she had never known. The ceremony was quiet, far from the flashing cameras of her New York years, attended by family and a few close friends. For a moment, as the faint sound of wedding bells drifted through the air, there appeared the possibility of peace. Marriage for Edie was not a storybook romance, but a yearning for refuge. She had lived too long in the chaos of fame, too long in the cycles of addiction and institutions, too long in the silence of her family's sorrows. What she sought was not grandeur, but stability, not glamour, but rest. Michael, by all accounts, was patient, devoted, willing to care for her despite the fragility of her condition. In his presence, she found a measure of safety, a promise that someone would remain beside her when others had turned away. The house they shared in Santa Barbara was modest, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of California life. The ocean was not far, and the eucalyptus groves still rustled in the wind, their scent lingering in the evenings. Edie, once the dazzling star of Warhol's factory, now lived in a world of quieter routines, cooking meals, tending to the home, walking with Michael through familiar streets. There was tenderness in this simplicity, as though life were offering her one final chance to begin again. Yet the past was never far away. Addiction lingered like a shadow, waiting in the corners. Though she strove for sobriety, the temptation remained, and her health, long battered by years of substances, was fragile. Hospital stays continued, each one a reminder that the stability she sought was fragile, conditional, easily disrupted. Michael stood by her, bringing her to appointments, supporting her efforts, holding hope even when her own hope faltered. But love, however devoted, cannot undo years of wounds in a single season. The marriage, brief as it was, revealed both the resilience and the inevitability of Edie's life. She longed for permanence, for a bond that could anchor her against the winds, and in Michael she found perhaps the closest thing to that anchor she would ever know. But even anchors can shift in storms, and Edie's storms were fierce. Relapses returned, nights grew restless, the old patterns re-emerged. She struggled between the desire for stability and the pull of escape, between the tenderness of love and the gravity of despair. Those who saw her in these final months remembered her as both luminous and diminished. She remained striking, her features delicate, her eyes expressive, her presence unforgettable. But the toll of her struggles was etched into her being. Her body was weakened, her moods unstable, her laughter less frequent. And yet, even in this diminished state, she could still captivate, still remind others of the star she had once been, the woman who had set New York aflame with her presence. We might ask, was marriage a true hope for her, or only another illusion, another fragile attempt to find in others what could never be given? Perhaps it was both. The vows she spoke carried sincerity, the bond she formed carried tenderness, but the wounds within her were deeper than any human love could mend. To live with Edie in those days was to love someone both present and absent, both yearning for life and retreating into shadow. Imagine her on a quiet evening at home, the lamps glowing softly, the sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen. Michael moves about with gentle steadiness, and Edie sits by the window, looking out at the darkening hills. The eucalyptus trees sway in the night wind, their whispering leaves filling the silence. She rests her chin on her hand, her eyes distant, her thoughts wandering to places unspoken. For a moment, the stillness soothes her. For a moment, she feels safe. But then the restlessness returns, the old ache, the unhealed sorrow, and the candle flame of her spirit wavers once more. The faint sound of wedding bells, once filled with promise, now drifts away, carried on the wind, fading into memory. From their echo, we move onward into the final chamber of her story, into her last months, where old habits returned and the rhythm of relapse and recovery gave way to the quiet inevitability of her end. The sound of wedding bells fades into the distance, their echo dissolving into the wind, and from that soft vanishing we follow Edie Sedgwick into her final months. Marriage had offered her a fragile shelter, a room where tenderness lived beside her, but tenderness alone could not hold back the tide of habit and despair. The patterns that had shaped her for so long, the reliance on pills, the cycles of treatment, the weight of sorrow, returned quietly, threading themselves through her days, until even the gentleness of Michael's devotion could not steady her course. The rhythm of her life became one of uneasy balance. Some mornings carried with them a sense of calm when she rose early, made coffee, and walked quietly through the house, her steps measured, her presence steady. On such days she seemed almost renewed, as though the years of chaos had given way to simplicity. She spoke of hope, of wanting to live quietly, of finding meaning in small routines. Michael, watching her in those hours, must have felt a cautious relief, as though the flame might steady at last. But the balance was fragile. By evening, the restlessness often returned. The ache of her past, the wounds unhealed, the hunger for escape, all pressed upon her. Pills found their way back into her hands, cigarettes burned endlessly in the ashtray. Her laughter grew sharper, edged with unease. The marriage, though sincere, became marked by this oscillation. Moments of tenderness followed by moments of collapse, promises followed by relapses, calm mornings dissolving into restless nights. Her health bore the weight of these rhythms. Years of strain had left her body weakened, her nerves frayed. The glow of her youth lingered in traces, but it was shadowed by exhaustion. Her eyes, once wide and filled with energy, now carried a heaviness that revealed the toll of her struggles. Yet even in decline, she remained magnetic. Those who saw her in these months still spoke of her beauty, her presence, her ability to captivate a room even when her voice was quiet. The star of the factory still flickered, though faintly, though unsteadily. In Santa Barbara, life moved at a slower pace than New York, yet the silence it offered was not always a comfort. For Edie, silence often carried memory. The quiet of the California evenings, with the wind moving softly through eucalyptus trees, echoed the silences of her childhood home, silences that had always been filled with repression and sorrow. What should have been peace sometimes became reminder, and so she drifted between longing for stillness and fleeing from it, between seeking calm and sabotaging it with restless escape. Michael remained at her side, patient, devoted, hopeful even in despair. He brought her to hospitals when her health faltered, supported her efforts at recovery, encouraged her small steps toward stability. His love was genuine, but love alone could not undo the years of collapse. He witnessed her brightness and her fragility, her laughter and her tears, her hopes and her relapses. To live beside her was to live beside a flame that warmed and wounded in equal measure. The city around them seemed indifferent to her struggles. To the wider world, she was already a fading figure, remembered in photographs, in Warhol's films, in the stories of a glittering decade now giving way to a darker age. Her image remained iconic, her fashion still imitated, her presence still mythologized. But the woman herself was slipping from view. Her final months lived in quiet obscurity, far from the cameras that had once captured her every gesture. We may ask, did she sense the approach of her end? Did she feel the clock ticking more insistently, the nights growing heavier, the flame weakening? Perhaps she did, for her writings and conversations in these months sometimes carried a tone of resignation, as though she understood that her life had been both too much and not enough, too bright and too brief. She spoke of wanting rest, of longing for release, of being tired of the cycles that had bound her. Her words revealed a spirit weary of struggle, though still yearning for peace. Imagine her one evening at home, the lamps dim, the sound of the ocean faintly audible in the distance. She sits at a small table, cigarette smoke curling upward, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. The clock ticks slowly on the wall, each second marking her restless waiting. Michael moves quietly in another room, his presence steady, his love silent. She leans back in her chair, her eyes half closed, her thoughts drifting. The night is calm, yet within her the storm continues, a tension between the desire to endure and the temptation to let go. The clock ticks slowly, marking time with indifference. Its rhythm is steady, unchanging, while hers falters, uneven, fragile. And from the sound of that clock we move onward into the chamber of her last night, when laughter, companionship, and silence converged, and Edie's flame flickered one final time before dissolving into darkness. The clock ticks slowly on the wall, steady and indifferent, its rhythm unchanging, as though it belongs to another world altogether. Time within its face is measured even without hesitation, while the time within Edie falters, uneven, fragile. It is beneath this patient sound that we arrive at her final night, a night at once ordinary and fateful, filled with moments of laughter and companionship, yet edged with a silence that carried her toward the end. On the evening of November 15, 1971, Edie attended a gathering, modest in scale, far removed from the brilliant parties of New York. The setting was quiet, intimate, the company small. There was laughter, light conversation, the warmth of friends and of Michael, her husband, steady at her side. Those who were present recalled her as gentle that night, even serene in stretches, as though a kind of peace had settled over her, fragile, but real. She laughed softly, her voice still carrying its charm, her gestures still delicate, her presence still captivating in its way. It was not the wild chaos of the factory, nor the restless glamour of Hollywood, but something smaller, closer to home. The California evening lay cool beyond the walls, the scent of eucalyptus drifting faintly in the air. Inside, the room glowed with a warm light, voices rising and falling in rhythm, the clinking of glasses punctuating the hours. For a time, it seemed as though she had stepped outside the storms that had followed her, as though the fragile balance she had sought might at last hold steady. And yet beneath the laughter, the old patterns remained. Pills were present, the substances that had shadowed her life never fully gone. She moved through the evening with grace, but also with the heaviness of exhaustion, her body weakened by years of strain. Michael, devoted and watchful, remained near her, guiding her gently through the night. When at last they returned home, it was with the ordinary fatigue of an evening spent in company, though for her the fatigue carried deeper weight. At home, the house was quiet, the lamps dimmed. The familiar walls enclosed them in silence, broken only by the soft rustle of movement, the faint creak of the floorboards. Michael helped her prepare for bed, his care tender, his devotion steady even in the face of her fragility. She slipped beneath the covers, the white sheets gathering around her slender frame. Her breath was slow, her eyes heavy, her body at rest at last. The night deepened and silence filled the room. It was in this silence that her final moments unfolded, not with drama or spectacle, but with the quiet surrender of a life that had burned too brightly. Sometime in the hours before dawn, her breath faltered. Whether by the weight of the pills or the exhaustion of her body, the flame that had flickered for 28 years gave way to darkness. She lay still, her face pale against the pillow, her body motionless beneath the sheets. Michael, who had stood by her with patience and love, discovered her in the morning, the stillness of her form revealing what words could not. There's a haunting gentleness in imagining her final sleep. No crowds, no cameras, no flashing bulbs, only the quiet of a small house in Santa Barbara, the steady ticking of a clock, the rustle of leaves in the night wind. The star who had once dazzled New York and haunted Warhol's silver walls now drifted into silence without fanfare, her end as fragile and understated as her life had been intense. We may ask ourselves, was there peace in her final hours? Did she, in the soft laughter of that last evening, find a moment of release? Or was her departure only another echo of the loneliness that had shadowed her from the beginning? The truth remains hidden, suspended in silence, as though time itself refuses to give us an answer. What we know is that her death, though quiet, reverberated. For those who loved her, it was a wound impossible to heal. For the world that had once adored her, it was the confirmation of what had always been sensed, that her flame was too fragile to endure, that her brilliance carried within it the seed of its own end. Newspapers would carry the news, voices would whisper, and the myth of Edie Sedgwick would grow, shaped by the tragedy of her brevity. Imagine the final details of that night. The faint rustle of a bedsheet, the slowing rhythm of her breath, the distant sound of the ocean waves beyond the hills. These fragments remain unresolved, suspended in memory like the final notes of a song that drifts into silence. And it is from this silence that we step forward into the morning after, when the news began to spread, when voices began to whisper, and when the absence of Edie Sedgwick became as haunting as her presence had once been. The rustle of a bedsheet lingers in the silence, a faint sound soon swallowed by stillness, and from that fragile fabric we move into the morning after, when the absence of Edie Sedgwick began to reveal itself. The house in Santa Barbara was quiet, its rooms holding the hush of early light, yet within it Michael discovered the truth. His wife was gone. The breath that had carried her through years of brightness and despair had ceased, leaving only silence. It was November 16, 1971, and she was 28 years old. News of her death spread slowly at first, carried by phone calls and whispers before it found its way into newspapers. The reports were brief, almost clinical, noting her age, her connection to Warhol, the cause suggested as barbiturate overdose. To the wider public, she had already become a figure of myth, remembered more as image than as woman, and her passing confirmed what many had long sensed, that her flame could not endure, that her life, so brilliant and unstable, had always been moving toward this end. The brevity of the notices, the detachment of the language, stood in contrast to the immensity of her absence for those who had known her. For her family, the loss was another chapter in a lineage already marked by sorrow. The Sedgwicks had carried tragedy through generations, and Edie's death deepened that legacy. Her parents, her siblings, all bore the weight of it in their own way, struggling to reconcile the fragile child they had known with the icon the world remembered. For Michael, her husband of only months, the loss was immediate and intimate, the quiet of their home now unbearable, the space beside him empty. He had stood beside her in her final months, offering what steadiness he could, and now he was left with silence. In New York, the news reached the factory and those who had once surrounded her. Warhol, ever distant, spoke little, his comments flat. detached, as though even in death she remained an image for him rather than a person. Yet the absence was felt in the silver rooms, the walls that had once reflected her presence, the cameras that had captured her gestures, the parties that had revolved around her brightness. All seemed haunted by the memory of her. Those who had known her there remembered her laughter, her quick wit, her sudden silences, and felt the hollowness of her absence. The newspapers carried her story into the public sphere, shaping her legacy as one of glamour and tragedy. Photographs accompanied the articles, images of her in black tights and chandelier earrings, her cropped hair framing her face, her eyes wide with a mixture of innocence and defiance. These photographs, once celebrations of her style, now became relics, fragments of a life cut short. Readers saw in them not only beauty but also fragility, the haunting sense that her gaze had always carried within it the knowledge of her own brevity. We may pause to wonder, how does absence become myth? How does the silence left by a person's death transform into a story retold, a symbol carried forward? For Edie, it was her very combination of brilliance and fragility, glamour and despair, that made her unforgettable. She was remembered not only for what she achieved, but for what she embodied, a generation's hunger for freedom, its experiments with art and excess, its inability to sustain the souls it consumed. In her absence, she became emblem, icon, symbol. Yet beneath the myth was still the woman, the child of California who had walked corridors of silence, the fragile daughter who had sketched in solitude, the young wife who had longed for peace. Imagine the morning after in New York, the streets bustling as always, taxis rushing past, newspapers fluttering on stands. On one page, a small column notes the death of Edie Sedgwick, once Warhol's superstar. Passers-by glance at the words, some pausing in recognition, others moving on without thought. Meanwhile, in the factory, the silver walls glimmer faintly under harsh bulbs, reflecting only the absence of the star they once framed. The reel of film that whirred endlessly now seems to pause, the hum of creation muted by loss. The absence spread outward, subtle yet profound. Friends remembered her in fragments, the way her laughter erupted suddenly, the way her earrings caught the light, the way she leaned against a wall, cigarette in hand, eyes distant. These fragments pieced together formed a mosaic of memory, incomplete yet enduring. Each friend carried their own version of her, their own piece of the woman who had once lit up their nights. And yet none could claim to have known her fully, for Edie herself had always remained partly hidden, partly unreachable, even to those closest to her. Her death at 28 placed her among the haunting pantheon of artists and icons who had died young, leaving behind not only grief but also fascination. Like others of her generation, she became part of a myth of brilliance extinguished too soon, a star who burned too brightly, a mirror of the fragility of the age. Her absence invited reflection, questions without answers, doubts that lingered. Was her death inevitable, the natural end of her story? Or was it preventable? Had love or understanding been greater? Such questions, unresolvable, keep her memory alive. A newspaper drifts across the pavement, caught by the wind, its pages fluttering as though whispering her story into the air. In that fluttering, we move onward, into the realm of her legacy, into the way her image endured long after her death, into the fashion and the myth, into the fragile immortality of photographs that never fade, though the life they captured has long since vanished. A newspaper drifts across the pavement, its pages lifted by the wind, the faint print of her name fluttering briefly before settling against the curb. From this fragile fragment of newsprint, we move into the long echo of her legacy. For though Edie Sedgwick's life had ended, her image endured. It lingered in photographs, in Warhol's films, in the memory of those who had seen her walk into a room and transform it with her presence. It lingered in fashion, in music, in the restless imagination of a generation that continued to recall her as a symbol of both beauty and fragility. Her style, once born of instinct and rebellion, became immortalized as a touchstone of the 1960s. Black tights paired with short skirts, chandelier earrings that caught the light, cropped hair that revealed the delicate bones of her face. These became more than personal choices. They became emblems. Designers and young women alike adopted them, imitating her image even as the woman herself faded from the world. To dress like Edie was to embody a certain spirit of the decade, a spirit that defied tradition while carrying within it a streak of vulnerability. Photographs of her continued to circulate, appearing in retrospectives, in books, in fashion spreads that hailed her as an icon. Each image froze her in time, laughing on a sofa in the factory, leaning against a wall with a cigarette, gazing into the camera with eyes that seemed both wide open and far away. These photographs became part of a collective memory, shaping not only how she was remembered, but also how the era itself was imagined. The 1960s, with all its contradictions, could be glimpsed in her face. Warhol's films, too, carried her forward. Though minimal in their structure, they preserved her presence in a way that no photograph alone could. In them, she moved, spoke, laughed, hesitated. She was not merely an image, but a performance, fragile and dazzling, ordinary and extraordinary. To watch these films after her death was to encounter both her vitality and her absence, to feel the weight of knowing that the woman on screen had already vanished from the world. The films became not only art, but elegy. Her legacy was also carried in whispers, in stories told by those who had known her. Friends recalled her wit, her charm, her sudden silences, her fragility. Some remembered her as radiant, others as broken, others still as both at once. No single memory could contain her, for she had been many things to many people: muse, friend, lover, sister, stranger. These fragments of recollection, scattered and partial, formed a mosaic that was never complete. Perhaps it is fitting that she remained elusive even in memory, never wholly grasped, always slipping through the fingers of those who sought to define her. Her name found its way into music, into poetry, into art beyond the factory. Musicians of the era invoked her image, whether directly or in veiled allusions, seeing in her both inspiration and warning. Writers spoke of her as a figure emblematic of the excess and sorrow of the 60s. In each retelling, she became more myth than woman, her life compressed into symbols: beauty, fragility, tragedy. This transformation into myth was both a tribute and a loss, for while it ensured her immortality, it also obscured the reality of her humanity. The child who had sketched in solitude, the young woman who had longed for love, the wife who had sought peace. And yet, her myth carried meaning. To many, she symbolized the dangers of fame, the cost of excess, the fragility of those who burn too brightly. To others, she embodied courage, rebellion, the refusal to conform. Still others saw in her only sadness, the haunting inevitability of a life that seemed doomed from the beginning. The multiplicity of her legacy reveals not only who she was, but who the world needed her to be. Each generation that looked back upon her found something of itself in her image. We may pause to ask, is it the fate of certain souls to live more as symbols than as people? Is immortality always a distortion, the transformation of a human life into myth? For Edie, the answer seems to lie in the tension between her enduring image and her fading voice. The world remembers her face, her fashion, her presence. It rarely hears her words, her thoughts, her inner world. She is seen endlessly, but not heard. Her voice grows faint, even as her image remains vivid. Imagine her photographs spread across a table decades later, glossy prints of her in the factory, magazine clippings, black and white portraits. A hand turns them over one by one, pausing at her gaze, at her laughter, at the tilt of her head. Each image carries with it both beauty and sorrow, for each freezes a moment that can never return. The woman in the photograph seems alive, yet the viewer knows she is gone. In this tension lies the haunting power of her legacy. The photographs fade slowly into sepia tones, their colors dissolving with time, yet the image remains, etched into memory, carried forward into the present. And from these fading images we move onward, into the final passage of her story, into the closing reflections that leave her life unresolved, suspended in ambiguity, a haunting star whose brightness still flickers in the imagination of those who remember her. The photographs fade slowly into sepia tones, their edges curling with the touch of time, yet her face lingers still, her eyes wide, her laughter frozen, her presence haunting. From these fading images, we move into the final chamber of her story, not to offer answers, but to sit with the questions she leaves behind. For Edie Sedgwick's life resists conclusion. It was brief, fractured, dazzling, and sorrowful, and its meaning lies not in tidy resolution, but in the ambiguities that shimmer around her like the remnants of a dream upon waking. She was born into wealth yet burdened by silence, raised among privilege yet shadowed by tragedy. She sought escape in art, in fashion, in love, in the glittering world of Warhol's factory, yet each escape led her deeper into entrapment. She was adored, imitated, immortalized, yet rarely understood. She longed for stability, sought it in marriage, in institutions, in quiet California evenings, but it always slipped from her grasp. At 28, she was gone, leaving behind not a legacy of accomplishment in the traditional sense, but something stranger, more haunting, an image, an aura, a question. What does it mean to live as an icon rather than as a person? What is lost when one becomes muse, star, symbol? For Edie, the price was high. The world remembered her style, her presence, her myth, but it let her voice fall silent. She is recalled in photographs, in films, in stories told by others, yet her own words remain faint, scattered, incomplete. To look at her life is to confront the uneasy truth that fame can illuminate and erase in equal measure, that visibility is not the same as being seen, and yet she endures. Her image continues to inspire, her story continues to be told, her presence continues to flicker in the imagination. Each generation that rediscovers her finds something new in her face: glamour, tragedy, rebellion, fragility. She has become not only a figure of the 1960s, but a mirror in which later ages glimpse their own obsessions with fame, beauty, and loss. Her unresolved story offers no answers, but it stirs questions that remain as urgent now as they were in her time. Perhaps this is why she haunts us still, not because she was perfect, nor because her life was exemplary, but because she was both radiant and broken, both seen and unseen, both alive and already slipping into myth. In her contradictions, we glimpse the contradictions of an era and of the human spirit itself. She reminds us that brilliance and despair are not opposites, but often intertwined, that the brightest flames carry within them the seeds of their own extinguishing. Imagine her now, not in the silver glare of the factory, nor in the quiet of a hospital ward, but in some suspended space where time no longer wounds. She stands in black tights and chandelier earrings, her hair cropped, her eyes wide. She laughs, softly, gently, not with desperation, but with ease. The wind stirs around her, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and the faint hum of the city. For a moment she is free, not muse, not icon, not tragedy, but herself. Then the vision fades, leaving only the lingering sense that she is near, just beyond reach, forever elusive. We may close our eyes and wonder, was Edie Sedgwick a victim of her age or its mirror? Was she destroyed by the world that consumed her, or did she embody its restless hunger so completely that she became its most honest expression? Did she burn too brightly, or did we fail to shelter her flame? The answers slip away, unresolved, like smoke drifting upward, like photographs fading, like laughter dissolving into silence. The final breath dissolves into the air, soft and unseen, and with it her story ends. Not in resolution, but in remembrance, not in certainty, but in haunting. Edie Sedgwick remains suspended between light and shadow, a star who burned too fast, a symbol of a lost generation, a presence that lingers still, flickering in the imagination, whispering through the rustle of leaves, shimmering in the faded silver of memory.